Hello and welcome to the Dorothea Dix Park Cultural Interpretation Plan webinar. We have invited experts, advisors, and community leaders to this session so that they can learn about how they can share their unique perspective and help inform this process. So just to go over a little bit of an agenda for this webinar, we'll start out with some team introductions and then give a little bit of context about the Dix Park Master Plan and the need for a cultural interpretation plan. And then we're going to talk about what a cultural interpretation plan is, what the purpose is, what that process will look like, who are we going to engage with along the way. We'll talk specifically about your role, time commitment, and preparation, and then talk about the project schedule. When we hosted this webinar on the 23rd, we encouraged folks to use the chat to ask questions, which we have provided in written format as an attachment to this. And we've also included some other questions that came in after the webinar as well. So first, I'd like to introduce the City of Raleigh team. We have a great group of folks that are helping pull this plan together. Kate Pearson, Eric Regensberger are planners with Dix Park. We also have Trey Roberts and Nick Neptune with the Dix Park Conservancy. The Conservancy is the nonprofit arm and specifically helping us with a lot of the community engagement and outreach efforts as part of this plan. On the consultant side, Cloud Geshen is the lead on the project. I'm Kate Oddie with Cloud Geshen, and along with Ian, we are doing project management and conceptual direction for the cultural interpretation plan. We are working with Brocade Studio. They are experts in interpretive planning and facilitation, so they will be leading most of the discussions that we're having and helping us think about how interpretive planning and storytelling can come to life in Dix Park. And lastly, we are working with public participation partners. They are Raleigh-based, so they have a lot of familiarity with the park and the area, and they'll be helping us with public engagement, helping us think about how to plan for those sessions, and also how to collect and record feedback. So just to give a little introduction about Cloud Geshen, we are experiential graphic designers, so we are interested in storytelling in public spaces. And that takes a lot of forms. That can be signage, walkways, digital experiences, interactive experiences. We've worked all over the country and internationally on memorials, signage projects, parks, institutions, all focused on how to tell stories in a graphic and written or experienced way. And then Brocade brings a lot of experience with interpretive planning and facilitation. They are particularly experienced in facilitating difficult conversations, nuanced conversations about topics that maybe haven't been had before, bringing groups together to really talk about how folks feel about different perspectives, about narratives that aren't currently being explored in the space or at the institution. And so we're seeing a lot of those similar kinds of conversations and planning happening with this project as well. And then lastly, with P3, as I mentioned, they are right here in Raleigh. They have worked on the Dix Edge project. So again, bringing a lot of knowledge about folks in the nearby community, but also throughout the city, and have a lot of expertise in engagement and recording feedback and keeping track of all the different things that we'll be doing throughout this project and our engagement activities. So what is a cultural interpretation plan and why? So to really understand what a cultural interpretation plan is, or why you would engage in one, it's helpful to actually go back to the master plan. And the master plan was an exercise that the city started several years ago. For those of you who are familiar with the park, you'll know that there are some spaces right now that feel very park-like and some spaces that don't. And so the master plan was an exercise to imagine how this site could be transformed into a world-class park that provides space for recreation, cultural activity, reflection, and learning. So both visioning exercise and a planning exercise. And throughout that process, they uncovered a lot about the site's history and landscape. And we're also thinking about how the site is currently used and how it can be used in the future. And so this plan presented a really strong need for connecting the site's history to the current and future vision of the park. Through that process, we kind of see the site's history falling into 4 main categories. It, of course, originally was indigenous land. It then became Spring Hill Plantation. Some of that plantation land then became Dick's Hospital. And then we're now in the more present and future era of where it has become Dick's Park. So a core principle of the master plan was build from what is there. And it really calls us from an interpretive planning perspective, but also from a use and construction perspective and project perspective, to not try to overcome or erase the site history. It asks us to embrace the history and allow that to shape the future of the park. It also asks us to honor the history of the park, to bring meaning and relevance to the site's complex layers of history, and particularly through interpretation that is going to encourage dialogue and learning and reflection, so that we can express the site's history in meaningful ways throughout the park. So another major theme of the master plan was history and reflection. So the master plan acknowledged that these were important aspects of the park, but didn't specifically outline any projects that were going to speak to interpretation. And it kind of outlined that this could be done in multiple ways. It could be through traditional graphic interpretation, like exhibits, markers, and memorials. It could be through landscape restoration or narratives. It could be through partnerships, so identifying organizations and groups that could help us create storytelling opportunities or programming. And it also could be done through events, tours, oral histories, lectures, or performances. So it brought up a bunch of ideas, but not necessarily assigned to a specific theme or topic or place in the park. So the master plan was adopted by City Council in 2019. And for those of you who use the park and are familiar with it, you're aware that there's several construction and planning projects that are already underway. And as these projects come online and are planned, we have a very strong need for incorporating and interpreting history and culture in the park, so that we know where those stories belong and how they interact with and can complement some of these new construction projects and ways that people are using these spaces. So a cultural interpretation plan is really the big goal for this plan is is to develop a unified vision for how to interpret Dix Park history with site-specific, culturally responsive approaches. It is meant to elevate historical and cultural consciousness by highlighting underlying meaning and underrepresented voices. Our process will also center equity, focus, accessibility, and respect in engagement efforts. This is an important aspect to touch on, because for those of you who were involved in the master plan or have been involved in other planning processes for other parks or city initiatives, it's often focused on getting as many different people in the room as possible. And that works for most of those types of projects. For this project, we know that we have some themes that really require focused conversations to understand perspectives and sensitivities around those themes. And in order to create an equitable and accessible process for those, we are going to keep those a little bit more focused, rather than inviting, everyone in the city to weigh in on what specifically should be presented with those narratives, or helping us understand what's a really important thing for other people to understand or experience when we're talking about those topics. So there will be opportunities later on for a larger audience to weigh in on some of these ideas, but that has an appropriate time and format for that type of engagement. And then lastly, we want this plan to be pragmatic. It needs to present a decision-making framework. It needs to present a strategy for implementation, so that when this plan is finalized, there's a vision for how to get things built and created. So there are 4 main elements of a cultural interpretation plan, and these elements also roughly parallel what our process looks like. So the first element is storytelling. We want to understand whose stories and perspectives, who are we connecting with, what are we saying, what are we experiencing? Then there's the place element. Where do these stories or opportunities belong in the park? There's the conceptual strategy. How can we realize these stories and opportunities in the park? So identifying types of projects and ways that we could express these narratives. And then lastly, an implementation strategy. When do we do this and how? So let's talk about the storytelling component. This is largely about learning and listening, and we've started this process, but we're very much still in the learning and listening stage. So we started by engaging with several Dix Park groups, including the Legacy Committee, the Community Committee. There is a task force made up of a few representatives from each of those groups, talked with staff, and we will be meeting with the leadership committee as well. And really these discussions are to understand some of the work that's already been done, what people's priorities are, et cetera. And then we've also learned from some of those conversations about a lot of the work that has already been done. So a lot of the research that has already been collected, a lot of resources that are out there that we should reference to help inform our work. So then the next step is really where we are with you today. And those are discussions with experts, advisors, and leaders, folks who have perspectives about a specific topic, one of these 4 topics listed here, who can help guide us as we develop interpretation around these topics. And the last step of this storytelling phase is workshops, which I'll get into in just a moment. But first, let's talk about your role. So like I said, you have been nominated and invited here because of your expertise and experience, regarding one of these 4 themes. So Dick's Hospital and mental health, Native American voices and culture, Spring Hill Plantation or descendants, and ecology. And what we really see your role being is that we'd like to hear your knowledge and opinions about one of these topics that you have a unique perspective on and how it relates to Dick's Park. We want to learn about past and ongoing efforts and relationships, and we want to understand sensitivities, challenges, and opportunities with these themes and interpretation. We'd also really like your guidance to help us plan for workshops and help us determine who else should be involved in these discussions. So for these first 3 topics, we feel very much like we need additional conversations with folks. We need more perspectives, more learning to help us understand, again, how these topics fit in with interpretation at Dick's Park. And so we will explore that in storytelling workshops. So we'll have one about Dick's Hospital and mental health, one about Native American voices and culture, and one with descendants of people who were enslaved and descendants of slave owners. And in these workshops, we'll be exploring possible narratives, perspectives and sensitivities, how folks would like to experience these narratives or interpretation, and what some opportunities are. So that could either be project opportunities or programming opportunities. We'll have 2 workshops per topic. Those will be held this spring. And as I said, really meant to be a conversation, a listening exercise for us so that we can learn what people are interested in either in expressing in the park or how they would like to experience that in the park. So then the storytelling phase comes together through this organization and strategizing phase. So as you might know and expect, there are a lot of sub-themes to each of these very, very broad categories and others that we didn't mention as a specific focus topic. There are lots of other aspects of the park's history that overlap and relate to some of these themes. And in this organization and strategizing phase, we're going to take all of that research, all of those workshops, everything that we've heard, and understand how we can connect the past with the present, how we relate these themes to each other. We'll identify how to uplift underrepresented voices, how to encourage dialogue, how to facilitate ways to tell and experience these multifaceted histories. And we also want to identify opportunities for ongoing partnerships. So while we're developing that storytelling piece of the cultural interpretation plan, we also have to be fairly focused about the place. We need to think about where these stories belong. So their placement, their prominence, and their usage, how that overlays or relates to activities going on at the park. We want to look at existing interpretation and programs. We want to understand physical infrastructure and staffing and resources that are available in the park. We want to identify the audience desires and needs, so people that are currently using the park and maybe folks that haven't used the park or haven't felt invited to use the park in those ways yet. We want to identify physical assets and opportunities, and we also want to keep an eye on future development so that we're planning things that make sense for as the park evolves. So then the storytelling component and the place component comes together in this conceptual strategy phase. And this is when we think of individual projects and ideas for projects for how to tell these stories in the park. So that could mean a lot of different things. It could be events, signage, something that's interactive. It could be community art. It could be commissioned art, exhibits, etc. And to help us think about those things, we'll be looking at peer institutions and other projects that relate to either the place, the subject matter, the experience that we're trying to create, and use those examples to help us determine a direction that we think makes sense for the park. And so this step of the process is going to involve more feedback from the public. This will be done as an engagement activity of where we're showing a lot of different ideas, a lot of different directions and recommendations, and allowing folks to tell us how they would like to interact with those stories or allow them to respond to things that they get really excited about. And so that then comes together in the implementation strategy. So as you can see with the examples on this page, we're not going to take it into design just yet. This strategy and this plan is really meant to just establish a conceptual direction for the project and propose possible locations for those if it is a physical feature. So it's connecting the place, it's connecting the type of project. It also is going to connect some of the research and the storytelling so that we have a very clear plan of the scope of a project and where it belongs and what we would need to do in order to make it happen. So this is kind of the pragmatic, nuts and bolts part of the plan. It really needs to be specific and achievable. That includes a decision-making framework so that we know how to prioritize projects or what is achievable. We want this plan to work within the resources that the park has or will have. We need this plan to identify who is going to initiate, help create, own, and maintain these projects. It also needs to coordinate with all of the other projects, programs, and initiatives in the park, and also needs to present a range of size of projects, phasing, whether it's temporary or permanent, et cetera, so that we have a lot of different options depending on budgetary constraints, expected lifespan, and maintenance requirements. So our process and schedule for this work, we are in that research and interview stage through next month. So in the coming week, you will be contacted by Brocade Studio to set up a small group discussion. And this is really about, so like I said, these discussions will be focused on a specific topic to help inform the planning process and help set up for those storytelling workshops, which will be conducted in spring of this year. Then we'll move into the interpretive strategy development. That's when we're organizing the information and thinking of potential projects for how those could be expressed. Then we'll do the second phase of outreach in the conceptual workshops, which will be early 2024. And all of that comes together to finalize the plan by summer of next year. So again, just to summarize your role in this process and really what you can expect from it from a time commitment perspective. Most of you will be asked to all of you will be asked to join a discussion, a virtual discussion. Probably will take about 1 to 2 hours, and these will be conducted in small groups with the other folks who have a unique perspective on the same topic. So they will be focused on one of those four topics that we shared earlier. If your perspective is focused on one of the themes that includes a storytelling workshop, you will be invited to participate in that as well. And you will also be invited to participate in the concept workshop, which is where we're showing those project ideas and proposing ideas for how these narratives can be experienced in the park. In terms of preparation, really none is needed unless you have research and documents that you think would be either useful for the discussion or for us to review. So if you have something that you want us to know about, that would be great to send us in advance or during the discussion or after. And then, of course, if you have any questions about this process or your role, please feel free to reach out to Eric or another member of the team so that we can facilitate any questions you may have or clarify what the next steps are. And as I mentioned in the beginning, any questions or discussion that came up during our webinar or that we've received after, we've summarized in a Q&A sheet that you can reference as well. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to talking to you more about this project and sharing our progress as our plan develops. Thank you.